going to throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Javonte Williams to the left of Howell. He'll send him out into the flat right side. Howell looking, standing tall, lets it go. Man there. Touchdown. Touchdown, Carolina. The pistol. Jackson behind him. Hands off to Jackson. He tried a jump pass, and it's intercepted. Zack intercepts it. Holy cow, Carolina's going to win. And off to Javonte Williams again. Pops it to the left. Javonte leaps over a man, crosses the 50, trucks over a defender, spins by another. Goodness gracious, he's down to about the 15, and he did absolutely everything in one carry.
Here's the shotgun snap to Aguilar. Drops back. Pressure coming. Aguilar floats it up. Incomplete. No flags. Head on back up the mountain. Carolina wins it in double overtime. Loftus out of the shotgun. Throws to the end zone. Incomplete. Incomplete. The bell belongs to us. Carolina wins it. 47-45 in double overtime.
Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, with you guys. As always, Zack Hubbard alongside of me. And guys, we needed to do an edition of the podcast here today. We needed to do this as soon as we possibly could because Carolina has landed a huge commitment on the 2026 recruiting trail. Almost said 2024. Geez, I wish it was 2024. It feels like it sometimes. But, yesterday Carolina, ends up landing two players that we knew going into their announcements Carolina was probably going to end up landing, but these are two guys that are big for Carolina, not only on the 2026 trail, but especially when it comes to the in-state 2026 trail. We've talked so much about how Carolina is struggling in the 2026 class with the in-state prospects. They have, missed on a lot of the top guys. Most of them never even really competitive. Don't even know if they wanted to really be competitive. These were two guys that Carolina wanted to be competitive with. So we're going to talk about them, break them down for you guys. And then, of course, we also have to talk about another weekend of official visits that's on the horizon. This will be another one that'll be pretty jam-packed. Not nearly as many guys that'll be on campus, but still a lot of really big targets that Carolina wants to be able to bring in. So we'll talk about those guys that'll be on campus. I'll tell you a little bit about where some of those recruitments stand and the guys that I'm feeling best about going into the weekend. But let's talk about the commitment of the Griffin-Haynes brothers. Carolina gets it done after basically being eliminated. In less than 2 weeks, they went from being eliminated to landing the commitment of Zavian Griffin-Haynes. Never officially eliminated for Jaden Griffin-Haynes, but you would imagine that if he had been or if Zavian had stuck with that and ended up keeping Carolina eliminated, there's a good chance that they probably would have both ended up at Florida State. I think there was an appetite for both guys to play. Florida State and Carolina were the only two schools that were willing to take both guys on, at least from the offers that were out there. I know that Zavian did have an NC State hat that was on the table, but that was not the original school that they said was going to be there as part of his top four alongside the other hats. I know they expected that Nebraska was going to be there alongside Georgia, and neither one of those hats showed up. It was really just the three hats on the table. So very interesting from that perspective. But I think Carolina and Florida State were the two that were really battling for him, and Carolina ends up getting it done. So first of all, Zack, Zavian, a former commit under Mac Brown, ends up recommitting. How big is that commitment, especially for Carolina, but just both of these guys overall in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. I think that this is a huge addition, not only to the class as it stands currently, but the class moving forward. First and foremost, this is a really big in-state win for the Tar Heels and their recruiting. Like you mentioned, we've seen sort of a mixed bag of them getting guys, or even, showing any interest either on the part of this staff or recruits for any sort of relationship there. So really good to have that as sort of a good step forward in that regard. But other than that, a good player here, a guy that's within the top, not only 500, but 300, 4-star recruit, former commit. So a guy that obviously both staffs saw something in. And, just looking at him overall as a player, very, very, very promising in terms of what he brings from height, weight, frame perspective. Listed at 6'6", 230 pounds right now, has the frame to continue to add weight and be a really elite factor on the edge. From what we see right now, there's going to continue to be some development in terms of shedding blocks, getting to the quarterback, sort of production in terms of the stats. But I think right now he looks to be a guy that can be very, very effective setting that edge, being a physical body there, not allowing guys beyond the line of scrimmage, and seems pretty comfortable playing sort of that hybrid defensive end, outside linebacker role, whatever terminology you want to use. He is comfortable, covering a guy into the flat. He's comfortable, having his hand on the dirt and, rushing the passer. So really a lot to like here. And, it is hard to overstate how big it is to get a guy of this caliber that is in-state, 4-star guy in this class. And, it's exciting to see what sort of dividends that'll pay down the line.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things right out of the gate is that you're getting a guy that is going to be very impactful in your in-state recruiting. You would think that him, along with his brother, will be able to help you get potentially some of these other guys in state that Carolina is still trying to go after. The other thing is that school is a hotbed. Rolesville High School, I mean, you've got Amir Brown in the 2027 class, Marquise Haynes in the 2027 class, and there's going to be other guys that are going to come out of there as well that you would expect could, start to get a little bit of run as we go on, maybe even guys in the 2026 class, somebody that you want to add late, or if they burst out onto the scene this year in the 2027 class or 2028 class, that's a big pipeline to have for Carolina. I mean, you've got Kevin Reddick, the former linebacker who is a coach there, so that certainly helps. But I mean, this is big from that perspective. It's also big because you get an edge rusher that you can mold, and you're hoping you can turn into one of those really talented edge rushers that you thought you were getting when you landed guys like Des Evans, like Curtis Simpson, a couple of the other names that come to mind, Malachi Hamrick, those types of guys. Now, there's a difference. A lot of those guys were incredibly productive at the high school level. You're talking about guys that had 30-plus tackles for loss, 20-plus sacks in a season. I don't think Des Evans was nearly that crazy if I remember his recruitment. But the other guys, yeah, they were guys that were just stat compilers. They went off at their high school levels. You probably should have read more into the fact that they were, lower levels in the state of North Carolina, lower than the 4A. Not saying that it's 1A or anything like that. But this is a little bit different. You're talking about a guy that did not register a sack last year. 48 total tackles, 12 and a half tackles for loss, no sacks, 20 quarterback hurries, and 1 pass defense on his way to earning all conference honors, and was part of a defense that was really good, helped lead that Rolesville team to the state title game against Grimsley, but wasn't nearly as productive as you thought he was going to be. Because in the previous season, as a junior, he had 50 total tackles, 27 of them were for a loss, 4.5 sacks, same 20 quarterback hurries, and 6 pass breakups. So it just wasn't nearly as productive. And I think that leaves some people sort of scratching their head, because he played in every game. You turn on the film and he looked like he was involved in just about every game, but for some reason it just wasn't there. Now, The one thing is that you sometimes when you have that, people will say, well, what about the motor? Was it a guy that was just, taking a little bit of an off year because his sophomore year was so successful? I don't really think so. I don't watch his film and think there's a motor problem here. I think that he was a guy that was running down plays from behind in the run game. I think, you could see that there was the intensity there, especially once he got to the ball carriers. But I just, for some reason, the statistics never really added up. Now, a lot of it, there were plays that you could classify as sacks, but quarterbacks had already tucked and run. That's up to the statisticians to determine what's a sack, what's not. So there probably were some that you could have credited as sacks. But the one thing that I really like about him is I think he's going to be a really good run defender. I think he sets the edge incredibly well. I think he does a really good job of getting into the backfield, making impactful plays on the ball carrier. And so I think that's one area that we've talked about with Carolina's edge rushers. It's been a big issue is that they are so overly aggressive that it leads to Carolina being vulnerable in those C and D gaps because teams are able to get outside the tackles and go to work, or outside those guards and go to work as well. So I think this is something that you're hoping, it shows up in his game and that he can be a good run defending edge rusher. The speed off the edge, I think, is solid, combined with a pretty solid release. And so I think he's got the tools. At 6'6", 230 pounds, you're not going to find guys with that sort of length. It's very rare. 230 pounds, I think you probably want to put a little bit more weight back on him. His sophomore year, he was 235 pounds. For some reason, his school decided to drop him in weight a little bit, dropped him to 230 this past year. That's at least what his highlight film said that he was playing at this past year. And so to me, you'd want to add just a little bit more weight on him because of how tall he is. But other than that, there's not really much that you're messing with the body. I think at 6'6", that length is really going to bother people. And that's what Carolina is looking for. They're looking for guys that have things that you can't teach. That's what they have with Trayshawn Ruffin. They've got the size in the middle. We talked about how he's a developmental prospect, but is a guy that is inside of the top 300. Trayshawn inside of the top 200. Same thing here for Zavian. The thing for me is that when I watched him, I didn't necessarily see the physicality. I see a very smart player. I see a guy who knows when he needs to drop into coverage. He knows how to make plays on the football. He does a good job of getting his hands up and affecting the passing lanes. I see all of that. I don't see the physicality in his game. And what scares me is when I watched him, I got the sense that he was very similar to Des Evans in high school, where I don't know why, but when I watched Des Evans, when I went and turned on, his film, his film wasn't bad. It was more when I went and saw him in a game in person. And I watched him, and he wasn't nearly as impactful as you felt like he needed to be. There were plays that he just didn't show up on that you felt like he needs to be there. I get the sense that that's something similar that we'll see from Zavian. I watched a little bit of one of his games earlier this year against Cardinal Gibbons and got a similar sense to that. And so that's one thing that I'm going to be watching moving forward. Now, it's a new coaching staff. Maybe they can develop him a little bit better. But I think that's the one area of concern that I have with him that hopefully he can get ironed out. What do you think when you hear those concerns from me, Zach? And do you think that with a different coaching staff, one that is going to be, we're hoping, known more for developing guys as opposed to just bringing in the talent like Mac Brown did, do you think that these are some areas that he will be able to improve once he gets to campus?
I think there's certainly potential for that. I, somewhat share your concerns about either, a lack of physicality or a lack of production or just lack of impact overall. And that's something that can be, difficult to find in a lot of guys in this day and age. And it's something that can be difficult to teach, but it can be taught. It can be instilled in guys. Now, in terms of will they have the ability to sort of instill that in Zavian or any other players, I would say there's a greater capability of that or greater probability of that under this coaching staff as compared to the last one. But, at the end of the day, it is going to be up to the player to respond to coaching, to respond to what's put in front of them. And I think from our perspective, either as people that, keep up with this, analyze this from the fans' perspective, you do have to give somewhat of the benefit of the doubt here, at least for a while, to this coaching staff to, let them build their roster, let them develop their guys. We know who Bill Belichick is as a coach for the most part. I mean, we know who he is at the NFL level, and he has a long career of consistency that, fans or outside observers can sort of use as a touchstone to say, okay, well, this is a guy that we feel knows what he's doing. So that's going to be, I think, sort of the attitude here in the first few years of, you have got to trust in who you've hired. You have to trust in the process of that. If they're going to be successful at all, they're going to have time to sort of instill that and see what they can do. And that's going to be the case specifically with Xavier, but that's going to be the case for the whole roster. Of, it's likely that we see an increase in guys playing with better fundamentals, with better energy, with better ferocity, but ultimately it's going to be up to the players to sort of respond to that and rise to the level that this staff and the fans are looking to see this team rise to.
Yeah, I mean, the level of physicality, I think, that's one thing that I do question sometimes whether that can be taught. And I do think that is, one of the big questions ultimately. Is it something that really you just have? You just know that you're coming in with a guy that plays with that edge. I mean, we've seen some of the guys that, Carolina landed at the end of the 2025 recruiting class that I saw and I threw on their film, and that was the first thing that stuck out to me, was just how physical they were. You go back and watch, some of the guys that Carolina landed recently. We look at it on the offensive line too. I mean, Eli Raquel, I saw a difference between him and Mason Wilhelm. I saw guys that, in Raquel that are physical, that want to get after guys on the offensive line. And then there's, questions from Wilhelm about whether or not that's there. Is that mean streak there? That's what my question is with a guy like Xavier. I think that everything else is there. All the other tools are there. It's a question of whether or not he is going to be the physical presence that he needs to be, because that's how he's going to be able to get after the quarterback. That's when you're going to start to see those sack numbers add up. I know, he's not the overly aggressive type, but still, that's when you're going to see on some of these obvious pass rushing downs, him be able to get after the QB, because that was the big issue for Des Evans. I just thought at times Des Evans was not nearly as physical enough as he needed to be. With Des Evans, I guess maybe some people question the motor, but I never really questioned that. It was just, I didn't think he could handle it physically at times going against some of these guys in pass protection. So we'll see. I think he is one of those prospects that has a very big boom or bust, tag on him. He's one of those guys that could be really, really good for Carolina, could be a staple of their defensive line for years to come, or he could be a guy that turns out like Des Evans, where we're talking about him every preseason. We're, saying that this is the year that he finally breaks out, and he's never really able to reach that full potential that we thought he would have. When you move on to Jaden as a linebacker, this one, he was an interesting guy, because when I originally threw on the film, I thought to myself, okay, this is a converted wide receiver. So we're going to see a guy that drops back into coverage a lot. We're going to see a guy that can cover sideline to sideline because of just how athletic he is. That was not at all what you saw. You saw a guy that was an incredible downhill defender, very physical at the point of attack. And I think, it is honestly what Carolina is looking for from their linebackers. I was shocked to see just how physical he was. That really surprised me. But when he gets downhill, he was laying into some of these guys. And I mean, you look at his stats from his junior season, first year at linebacker, 107 total tackles, 6 sacks, 10 quarterback hurries, an interception, 5 pass breakups, and 2 forced fumbles. Really did a good job as a blitzer, getting after the quarterback, getting in the quarterback's face, was very aggressive when he was given the opportunity to rush the quarterback. I think he's a guy that, Carolina would love to have in the middle of that defense if he can continue to progress, that can get after the QB. That's what we saw last year from Amari Campbell. That's what we're hoping to see this year from a guy like Andrew Simpson. But I mean, he's a guy that really showed up in run defense. Now, the thing is that I do think he is kind of limited. I think he's one of those guys that, has, the motor. He's got that high energy play style that shows up throughout his film, but he's really only a guy that fills in the A and B gaps. That was the area that I saw him making every single tackle that was on his highlight film, pretty much in the run game. There were a few times where they would drop him into coverage, but he was not necessarily a guy that looked even that natural in that, shockingly. Didn't see him cover sideline to sideline by any means. Really, again, more of a guy that just the minute that a ball carrier took it, he was heading downhill trying to make the tackle. So I do think that that's something that's a little bit different from his brother, where I think his brother maybe a little bit more cautious, not nearly as aggressive as an edge rusher. Him, an incredibly aggressive linebacker, guy that, is really going to, in order to proceed at the next level, you're really going to have to look at him and hope that he can develop more of that sideline to sideline game. The coverage ability, I think, is an area they have to work on with him, because you saw it very sparingly in his junior film. And when you did look a little stiff in some of those pass coverage reps. The good news is that he's a guy that, played wide receiver, caught 16 passes for 220 yards and 2 touchdowns in the regular season of 2023. They did not have an update on his stats as they went throughout the playoffs, but is a guy that is used to catching the football. So that's one thing that you really like about his ability in coverage, is that he is able to play the ball. He is able to come down with interceptions. That's something that's a little bit different from some of these other linebackers, but very interesting player, Zach, that I think is going to take some time to develop, especially coming off his first year at the linebacker spot. But certainly a guy that Carolina, I think, has the ability to develop, and he could become a part of what they do, at least from a rotational standpoint, at the linebacker spot at some point in his career.
Yeah, I think that Jaden is a pretty interesting prospect, especially when you compare him to his brother. I mean, Xavier is pretty straightforward. You sort of know what you're looking for, what you're getting, where because there's sort of that positional conversion here, Jaden is more so of a raw prospect that you can see go a number of different ways. Like you mentioned, sort of the positives that you see first and foremost on the film is him as a blitzer. I mean, he is right to the ball carrier. He is flying through traffic, getting there. So that, in terms of skill, is really, that's solid. You know that you have that in your tool belt. Like you mentioned, as a guy that is a converted wide receiver, he's listed at 6'3", about 200 pounds, so pretty rangy. Looks like he has some pretty long arms too, so you like what you see from a frame perspective, but I think that does contribute to sort of the lack of lateral movement that you would love to see, and not a ton in terms of coverage, but I feel like that's something that could continue to develop. And this may be a guy that's not your, every down middle linebacker, but is in the rotation, like you mentioned. And, depending on how his frame develops, similar to his brother, he could be a guy that in certain packages on third down, you have one guy on either side of the line of scrimmage rushing straight to the quarterback. And I think that's an option. You'll see that, like we mentioned, a lot of these guys are more so of these hybrid linebacker, defensive end guys, and I think he can fill that role. Though I think the primary responsibility is going to be as an off-ball linebacker. So as of right now, I see him as an interesting future piece, another guy that's going to be somewhat developmental in what he turns into down the line. But I don't think there's really a set limit here that we know of at this point, just because this is still so new, and it's just going to be a wait and see on him to see what he turns into. I think the senior film, for me personally, watching it down the line, is going to be big to sort of say, hey, this is your next year playing this position. What do you look like now that, you're not new anymore? You've been here, you've done that. What does your body of work look like in that circumstance? That's what I'm interested to see coming up this fall.
Yeah, and I'm also interested to see what he looks like if he adds a little bit more weight. 6'3", 210 pounds. It's pretty light. That's a guy that typically is going to be playing more safety at the college level rather than linebacker. Even with, as thin as we've seen some of these guys, I think especially if you're going to be that thin, you've got to be good in coverage. And so that's an area that I think is going to be interesting to see whether or not he improves. Hopefully Rollsville plays a few more teams that are going to be willing to test them in that area. But, the other thing that's interesting about him is you look at Rivals, they list him as an edge rusher. And that could be one of those spots where maybe if they put, enough weight on him, and if he's able to show what he showed, blitzing through the middle of some of those defenses, if he's got, a little bit of physicality that he can play with, which we've seen it when he gets to ball carriers, you never really know. He could be a guy that fits in there. He is a piece of clay that is looking to be molded. He is as raw of a prospect as you get in this class. And so I think that the sky is the limit for him, but I also don't know where the floor is. I think this is one of those guys that Carolina adds. They are not going to stop looking at the linebacker spot. This, off-ball linebacker will still be a key for them because they just really don't know what exactly he is. But it's a guy that could turn into something really nice because of the motor that he plays with, because of the fact that he was as successful as he was in his first year at the position. So I think that's a big part of the reason why Carolina is willing to take him on. Now, when you look at the edge rusher spot, this is the first significant edge rusher that Carolina has landed in this class. I don't think anybody else, Jimmy Frisco, Alo Sulufau, is certainly a guy that I think is probably going to end up as an edge rusher. But he's going to be more that heavier edge rusher. That's at 6'3", 265 pounds, more what we're going to see from a guy like Price Yates. So not exactly what you're going to see on the other side of the defensive line coming off the edge. I think Carolina could still look to add another guy in this class, and especially because, with them having already lost Zack and Griffin-Haynes at one point during this recruiting process, I think they're still going to be very aggressive in making sure that they're covering all their bases. So I don't think they're done there just yet. Not a ton of targets at that position. I think that Zavian was one of their main focuses. I think, some of the other guys that Carolina was going after, some of the bigger names that they were going after, like Luke Waffle, a guy out of the state of New Jersey that they were hoping that they would be able to get, Carter Matthews, the 5-star out of Washington, D.C. That doesn't look like he's going to get on campus for a visit at any point. And even some of the guys that are a little bit lower on the totem pole that Carolina was going after. You remember when they offered Tarondre Spencer, one of the first guys that they offered, when Bill Belichick and his staff took over, doesn't look like Carolina's in on him either. So I think the only other guy that Carolina would be willing to take at the edge rusher spot is Julian Walker, the guy out of Dutch Fork High School in Irmo, South Carolina, who was on campus this past weekend. Seemed to enjoy his visit, was very, very public about his enjoyment of the visit, but is currently, a heavy lean towards South Carolina. Every recruiting website that you see strongly leans in the Gamecocks' favor. And what would you expect? He's from their backyard. Irmo is about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from Columbia, South Carolina. So you would expect that they would have a pretty good stranglehold on that recruitment. But Carolina, I think, at least gave him something to think about. So I do think that that's going to be interesting moving forward. In terms of other guys to watch from last weekend, after 4 commits, you have Zavian and Jaden Griffin-Haynes that both committed. Of course, earlier in the week, we did the podcast and we told you, broke down the commitments of Mason Wilhelm as well as Eli Raquel. And so, there was a group of 14 uncommitted prospects at the time. It actually grew a little bit more when you found out Keegan Chapman was on campus as well and eventually received an offer. there are some guys. I think Chapman is certainly one to keep an eye on. His brother, I still think is probably trending towards USC, but this is easily the biggest offer that he's received. A lot of FCS offers for him. And so I think this is certainly a guy that Carolina could be aggressive or could be in position to land if they want to get more aggressive and going after him. Zion Crumpton, the wide receiver out of Montgomery, Alabama, who did not have an offer coming into the weekend. Carolina offers him. Seems like they're in the lead at this point for him. And then also Julian Burns is another name to keep an eye on, the linebacker out of Monroe, Louisiana, who was on campus. A little bit quiet around his weekend, not nearly as much publicity about how he's feeling. But right now, Carolina is the only school that he has an official visit publicly scheduled to. So certainly worth monitoring over these next couple of weeks. You may be asking the question, well, who are we monitoring this weekend? Who's on campus this weekend? Just put out the article for you guys to take a look at of everybody who's going to be on campus this weekend. It'll start with 3 committed prospects. Trayshawn Ruffin, the 4-star defensive lineman from North Duplin High School in Mount Olive, North Carolina. Maybe Carolina's biggest asset when it comes to current recruits that are trying to recruit other guys. He has been all over it since he officially flipped his commitment from Texas A&M. He's been trying to get multiple guys on board. One of his big guys that he was trying to get in here was Vodney Cleveland. Unfortunately, doesn't look like he's going to take an official visit here, so his attention has shifted to some other guys. Having him on campus, I think, is going to be a big asset. You also have 3-star running back Crew Davis, who's been committed to Carolina for a while, one of their original commits under Bill Belichick after he took over. And then 3-star interior offensive lineman Zion Smith, another guy who, is a guy that goes to a powerhouse school in DeMatha Catholic up there in Hyattsville, Maryland. Chose Carolina almost, immediately once he was able to get on campus. And so another good guy that I think you can have around that's trying to help recruit some of these guys. Now, the guys that are going to be on campus that are uncommitted, 4-star athlete CJ Sadler out of Cass Technical School in Detroit, Michigan. This is one of those guys that's as big of a visitor as you can get. Inside of the top 100, easily a guy that Carolina should be pushing incredibly hard for, because if they can get him at the slot position in this class, that would be huge. You would talk about, a guy that would fall in similar ilk to Josh Downs in terms of the hype around a slot receiver coming out of the high school level. Took a visit to Maryland last weekend, which supposedly blew him away, according to some of the articles that were written after that. Also is planning to visit Miami, Colorado, and Michigan at some point. I know Colorado is definitely on the public ledger that is on 24/7 Sports. They're listed as one that has an official visit set. Don't know whether or not Miami is officially set, and I'm pretty sure that Michigan is not officially scheduled just yet. But if he gets to Michigan, that feels like that's a spot where he's probably going to end up. Chase Campbell, the 4-star wide receiver from Friendship High School in Wolforth, Texas. A guy that Carolina, we talk about the guys that Carolina's recruiting in the state of Texas. This is one of the guys they've done a pretty good job with to this point. Now, the thing for him, as packed of an official visit schedule as you're going to see, he visited Arkansas and Tennessee already, has trips to Utah, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and Baylor still on the horizon, on top of the one that he has to Carolina. So his recruitment pretty wide open. Definitely a guy that's going to be worth keeping an eye on, though, because Carolina, I think, has a fighting chance, believe it or not. They just need to outshine some of those local schools. Being in the ACC, being with, Bill Belichick as their head coach, I think they've got an opportunity to do that, but it's a question of whether or not they can actually get it done. Tyree Jimerson, the 3-star offensive tackle from Paulding County High School in Dallas, Georgia, took a visit to Ole Miss last week, still has visits scheduled with Kentucky and Georgia Tech, but it feels like Carolina's got an opportunity here if they want to seize it this weekend. Same thing with another Peach State guy in Jamar Owens, the 3-star safety from Douglas County High School in Douglasville, Georgia. This one, pretty quiet one, and the Tar Heels, have positioned themselves relatively well here. It's weird. Don't really see a whole lot about him in terms of some of the schools that he is visiting or will be officially visiting this month. This is the first official visit that we see him taking. It doesn't appear like he took one last week. I would say Georgia Tech is the in-state team. Definitely a team to watch. I know he was very high on USC at one point, but doesn't seem like there's much of a push to get him on campus. So Carolina with an opportunity to potentially, come away with his commitment here, very similar to some of the other guys that we saw last week that just don't necessarily have visits scheduled elsewhere. Maybe it doesn't happen over the weekend, but could certainly be a guy that pops eventually. Then you get to the two guys that probably have the best chance to pop over the weekend, and that is, granted, the two lowest ranked players, but that was the two lowest ranked players that were on campus last week that committed. 3-star offensive tackle Landry Breedy out of Mentor High School in Mentor, Ohio. If that high school sounds familiar, it should. That's where Mitch Trubisky came from. Pretty high-end Ohio high school. Definitely a squad that has produced some really good players over the years. The Tar Heels, again, only school that has an official visit, it appears like, to this point. Don't see anybody else that's really a threat to get an official visit. So Carolina, if they want it, can potentially wrap up his commitment this weekend, I feel like, just from judging off where his recruitment is at. And then Nick Fiamora, you talk about a guy that's going to be really active on social media this weekend. I think this is him. This is a guy that doesn't have an offer coming to campus, but I think if he gets one, he is going to jump on it immediately, because you can see through his social media that he is really pushing hard, on the fact that he is visiting this weekend, wants everybody to know that he's going to be there. So I would not be shocked if similar, probably even a little bit more so, than Keegan Chapman, who hasn't yet committed. I think this is one that, he could walk in without an offer and could walk away a member of this Tar Heel class when it's all said and done. So make sure you keep an eye on the website, HeelToughBlog.com, for any updates on this recruiting weekend and all that stuff moving forward. We'll see what ends up happening. Hopefully Carolina is able to land somebody, and if they are, we will be back here on the podcast as well to recap that for you. But the website is the best place to monitor right now for up-to-the-minute coverage of the football program, what's going on with recruiting, what's going on the field, and, of course, the basketball program as well. Make sure that you're keeping tabs on everything that's going on in the offseason. We're about to enter our offseason series on the Four Corners podcast, so make sure that you are subscribed to that podcast, the same places that you are subscribed to this podcast. We would greatly appreciate that. Also, make sure you head over to social media, whether it's Twitter. That's probably the best place to follow, because you can turn on the post notifications. You just hit the follow button, hit that little notification button that's right next to it. Turn on all notifications, because we don't retweet anything off of that account. That is literally just our content straight through. So anytime that there is something new that breaks, you will be notified of it, whether it is us, putting a story up, it's us doing a podcast, whether it's live or if we're tweeting it out afterwards. Any of that stuff you will find on there. You can also find it on the Facebook page. Just search Heel Tough Blog on Facebook and go ahead and like the page. When you do, you'll automatically be following it. And so anytime that we go live, you'll get a notification that we're going live. You won't get notified about articles and everything like that, but still something that you can check throughout the day to get up to date on all of the latest news and opinions on Tar Heel football and basketball. So that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Zack for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.